In Basel, Switzerland, in the spring of 1943, a sharply dressed American banker climbed aboard a German submarine escort vessel. He was making his way from territory controlled by the Nazis back into neutral Switzerland, fresh off a round of meetings in Berlin with officials from the Reichsbank, the central bank of the Third Reich. His name was Thomas McKittrick. He wasn't a spy, wasn't a double agent, and wasn't a war criminal in any legal sense. He was president of the single most powerful international bank on the planet. And even as American soldiers were dying in North Africa and across the Pacific, he was sitting down amicably with the men architecting the Nazi war effort. Now here's the part that makes it even stranger. McKittrick had orders waiting for him back home. German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic had been told not to sink the vessel carrying him to Switzerland. Nazi Germany, a nation actively at war with the United States, had personally guaranteed the safety of an American banker because he was simply too useful to lose.
This is a chapter of history most textbooks skip past entirely. It isn't about battles, generals, or wartime speeches. It's about something far quieter and far more disturbing. The men in mahogany-paneled offices across New York, London, and Basel. Men in perfectly tailored suits who sat in church pews every Sunday, who knowingly bankrolled both sides of the deadliest conflict humanity has ever produced. And the truly chilling part isn't simply that it happened. It's that almost none of these men ever faced prosecution. Most were promoted once the war ended, and the very systems they engineered to make it possible are still humming along today.
To make sense of how bankers financed both sides of World War II, you first need to understand how they financed the conditions that made the war possible to begin with. When the fighting of the First World War finally stopped in 1918, the victorious Allied nations convened in Paris and produced one of the harshest peace settlements in modern history, the Treaty of Versailles. Its terms placed sole blame for the war on Germany and demanded reparations of 132 billion gold marks, roughly $31.5 billion at the time, a sum that, adjusted for today's purchasing power, would run into the hundreds of billions of dollars.
The figure was almost incomprehensible. It wasn't meant merely to compensate the Allies. It was meant to permanently cripple Germany as an industrial rival. The fallout was disastrous. By 1921, the German government was printing currency at a rate beyond ordinary comprehension. By November 1923, one US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread. Lifetimes of middle-class savings vanished in a matter of months. Factories shuttered, unemployment surged, and into that vacuum of desperation and humiliation, extremist political movements began to take root. Movements promising answers, however monstrous, to the question of Germany's collapse. This mattered a great deal to Wall Street, and not for sentimental reasons. American banks had lent enormous sums to Britain and France during and after the war, and those countries were counting on German reparations to help repay their American debts. If Germany's economy collapsed, the reparations would stop. If the reparations stopped, France and Britain couldn't repay New York. And if New York didn't get repaid, the entire transatlantic financial system risked a meltdown. So in 1924, Wall Street stepped in to rescue Germany, not out of goodwill, but out of financial self-preservation. The vehicle for this rescue was the Dawes Plan, named for Charles Dawes, an American banker and former Army general who led the international committee charged with restructuring German reparations. Dawes, along with figures like Owen Young, head of General Electric and a major Wall Street player, designed a framework that lowered Germany's immediate payments, placed the Reichsbank under foreign oversight, and crucially, threw open the American capital markets to German borrowers.
Beginning in 1924, under the Dawes Plan, Billions of dollars in bonds and short-term credit began pouring out of American investment houses and into the German economy. By decade's end, Germany had absorbed roughly 29 billion Reichsmarks in foreign loans, with American financiers, J.P. Morgan chief among them, supplying around 70% of Germany's foreign capital during that stretch. By 1929, German industrial output had climbed so sharply that Germany had become the world's second largest industrial economy.
But here's the detail rarely mentioned. A large share of that money didn't go towards schools, hospitals, or housing. It went toward rebuilding Germany's capacity for military production. The loans financed the modernization of steel mills, the expansion of chemical plants, and the development of technologies that would later be repurposed directly for war. The Dawes Plan wasn't simply a debt restructuring exercise. Functionally, it was pre-financing the Wehrmacht. And the money circulated in an almost comical loop. America lent to Germany. Germany used the funds to pay reparations to France and Britain. And France and Britain used those payments to service their own war debts back to America. Everyone's books balanced. Everyone collected interest. And Germany, quietly, rebuilt everything Versailles had tried to dismantle.
In 1929, the Dawes Plan gave way to the Young Plan, again crafted by Owen Young, which trimmed Germany's obligations further and pushed the final repayment date out to 1988, nearly 6 decades away. That same year, the Wall Street crash hit. Lending dried up instantly. Germany's economy sank back into depression, unemployment spiked once more, and Adolf Hitler, who had spent years shouting from the political margins, suddenly had millions of desperate, angry voters willing to listen. The bankers never set out to install Hitler, but they had engineered precisely the economic conditions that made his rise possible. By the early 1930s, a quiet but deepening relationship had formed between America's most powerful oil company and Germany's most powerful chemical conglomerate. A relationship so tightly woven that once war broke out, it became almost impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Standard Oil of New Jersey, heir to John D. Rockefeller's original empire and still controlled by the Rockefeller family, had maintained a close commercial partnership with IG Farben since the mid-1920s. Farben was Germany's industrial giant, a conglomerate producing everything from synthetic dyes to explosives, and later, Zyklon B, the gas used to murder millions in Nazi concentration camps.
The Standard Oil-Farben relationship centered on 2 technologies that would prove decisive once war arrived. The first was synthetic rubber. Germany had no domestic natural rubber supply, and without a synthetic substitute, its tanks, aircraft, and military boots couldn't be produced at scale. The second was synthetic aviation fuel, the hydrogenation process that let Germany turn its abundant coal reserves into gasoline. Without it, the Luftwaffe simply couldn't fly. Standard Oil held key patents covering both processes, and through cartel agreements struck in the late 1920s and early 1930s, that technology was shared with IG Farben and, by extension, made available to Nazi rearmament. A post-war captured internal Farben memo was blunt about this. It described the Standard Oil agreements as absolutely essential to Farben's operations, stating that without Standard's technical expertise and financial support, key parts of German war production could never have happened. What turns this from a mere business arrangement into something darker is what came after the war started. By 1940, the U.S. Department of Justice was investigating Standard Oil over its continuing cartel ties to IG Farben. The evidence was damning. Not only had Standard shared synthetic rubber technology with Germany, it had actively withheld that same technology from the American military. The U.S. Navy had sought access to Standard's butyl rubber research, and company executives deliberately stonewalled a Navy inspector to keep him from understanding the process, all while their German cartel partner was manufacturing rubber for the tanks and planes killing Allied troops.
When Senator Harry Truman's committee exposed the arrangement in 1942, the Justice Department threatened a full prosecution. Standard's president, Walter Teagle, who also sat on IG Farben's board, appealed directly to President Franklin Roosevelt, arguing a lawsuit would disrupt the war effort. Roosevelt agreed to a settlement. Standard paid a fine of $50,000 against revenues of $2 billion and issued a public statement, and the matter was closed. No executives went to prison. Through intermediaries in neutral territories, Spain, Switzerland, and Vichy-controlled parts of the Caribbean, Standard Oil kept supplying Germany with fuel throughout the war. As late as 1944, Spain was re-exporting roughly 48,000 tons of American oil to Germany every month. The shipments kept the Nazi war machine moving, and New Jersey's ledgers recorded it all as ordinary commerce. While all this played out in New York and New Jersey corporate suites, a quieter, more refined operation was running out of an unmarked building in Basel, so deliberately anonymous that it had no sign on the door and nothing visible from the street to suggest that inside sat what many financial historians would later call the most powerful financial institution on Earth, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS. Understanding what the BIS did during the war requires understanding what it was built for. Founded in 1930 by the central banks of Europe and the United States, with Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan among its key American founders, the BIS's stated mission was managing German reparations under the Young Plan. Its deeper purpose, spelled out in its founding charter, was fostering cooperation among the world's central banks, entirely outside the reach of national governments. The charter explicitly declared that the bank's assets could never be seized, even in wartime. It was self-funding, answerable to no parliament, president, or monarch, completely removed, as one early president boasted, from any government or political control. When war broke out in September 1939, the BIS confronted a fundamental choice: shut down, go dormant, or keep functioning. The board voted unanimously to keep operating under a declaration of neutrality, reasoning that the institution would be needed intact for post-war reconstruction. The deeper truth was that international banking didn't require a pause for war. It just needed different terminology. So while nations burned, the BIS stayed open, its board seating both Allied and Axis directors. Walter Funk, a senior Nazi official and Reich Minister of Economics, sat on the board throughout the war. So did Hermann Abs, chief executive of IG Farben, maker of Zyklon B, and Baron von Schroeder, whose Cologne private bank was deeply enmeshed in Nazi financial networks. All three were later convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg, and all three had sat comfortably on the BIS board while the war raged. The BIS's wartime conduct went well beyond passivity. It accepted looted Nazi gold, gold stripped from the central banks of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia, and from the personal belongings of murdered Jews, and moved it through its accounts. After Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Austrian gold reserves were seized and funneled to the Reichsbank through BIS accounts. When Czechoslovakia was occupied, SS officers held Czech National Bank directors at gunpoint to force the transfer of the country's gold reserves, reserves that had been placed with the BIS for safekeeping and presumed protected. The BIS forwarded them straight to Berlin. In total, the BIS took in 3.7 tons of gold from the Reichsbank during the war that later investigations confirmed had been looted from Belgium and the Netherlands. That gold was eventually returned to the Allied Commission in 1948, but during the war itself, it functioned as a working part of Nazi Germany's financial machinery. Which brings the story back to Thomas McKittrick, the man running the whole operation. He was appointed BIS president in May 1939, 3 months before Germany's invasion of Poland. An American lawyer with no background in central banking, but extraordinary connections in Washington, Wall Street, London, and Berlin.
When the BIS decided to keep functioning through the war behind a shield of neutrality, McKittrick became both its public face and its operational brain.
What that neutrality looked like in practice was striking. McKittrick moved freely through Nazi-occupied territory, met regularly with Reichsbank officials in Berlin, and conducted foreign exchange transactions on behalf of the Nazi government. Through the BIS's administrative procedures, he effectively recognized Germany's forcible occupation of 10 European countries, including France, Belgium, Greece, and the Netherlands, by accepting the transfer of those nations' BIS shares to their Nazi-installed occupation governments. At the war's height, Axis-aligned central banks controlled nearly 67% of BIS voting stock. Emil Pohl of the Reichsbank, personally responsible for processing gold pulled from the teeth of concentration camp victims, a crime for which he was later convicted at Nuremberg, privately called the BIS the Reichsbank's only real foreign branch.
McKittrick wasn't an ideological Nazi. He almost certainly found the extermination camps repulsive. But he embodied something arguably more dangerous. A banker who had concluded that international finance operated on a plane above national wars, above human rights, above the moral obligations binding everyone else caught up in the surrounding conflict. He had access to detailed intelligence on German war plans and passed some of it along to contacts in Washington, effectively functioning as an Allied intelligence asset while simultaneously keeping the Axis financial machinery running.
Once the war ended and the full scope of the BIS's conduct came to light, the United States pushed hard at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference to have the bank dissolved. The resolution to liquidate it passed and was then quietly never carried out, killed by the central bankers behind the scenes. McKittrick stepped down as BIS president in 1946 and was immediately named a vice president at the Rockefeller's Chase National Bank in New York, overseeing foreign loans. That same year, the Belgian government awarded him the Royal Order of the Crown. The BIS still exists today, still headquartered in Basel, still operating beyond the reach of any national government. One of the most powerful and least understood financial institutions in the world.
McKittrick's move to Chase was fitting, because Chase National Bank had already built its own remarkable record of wartime accommodation with the Nazi regime, not from the safe distance of neutral Switzerland, but from inside occupied Paris itself. When Germany overran France in June 1940 and installed the collaborationist Vichy government, most American businesses in France packed up and left. Chase National Bank stayed open. So did JP Morgan. While American diplomats were being expelled and American citizens interned, Chase's Paris branch kept doing business with the occupiers, freezing Jewish customers' accounts on Nazi instructions, and doing so, according to internal documents later reviewed by the U.S. Treasury, in what its own Paris branch chief described as a spirit of enthusiastic cooperation.
A confidential memo from Carlos Niederman, Chase's Paris branch director, to his superiors in Manhattan in May 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, with America now formally at war with Germany, described the bank as enjoying very special esteem with senior German officials and noted rapidly growing deposits. He was reporting this as good news. Business was booming under Nazi occupation. 6 months before Germany's 1939 invasion of Poland, Chase had wired $25 million to Germany to help finance its military buildup. A later French government commission investigating wartime banking practices found that 5 American banks, Chase, JP Morgan, Guarantee Trust Company of New York, Bank of the City of New York, and American Express, had helped hand over roughly 100 Jewish-held accounts to Nazi occupation authorities in France. None faced meaningful criminal prosecution. Some paid civil settlements decades later. The executives moved on to distinguished careers. The banks only grew larger.
The BIS and Chase operated on a sweeping institutional scale. But the story of how American banking money reached the Nazi war effort also unfolded in smaller, more personal arrangements. One of the most striking involves Prescott Bush, a Yale-educated investment banker from Connecticut who would later serve as a U.S. senator, whose son George Herbert Walker Bush would become the 41st president, and whose grandson George Walker Bush would become the 43rd. In the 1920s, Prescott Bush became a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, at the time the largest private investment bank in the world by its own account. His father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, had helped forge a key financial relationship with Fritz Thyssen, the German steel and coal magnate who was one of Hitler's most important early financial backers through the 1930s. Thyssen had personally funneled millions of marks to the Nazi Party before Hitler took power, and he needed an American banking channel to move assets across the Atlantic. That channel was the Union Banking Corporation.
Prescott Bush served as a managing director of Union Banking Corporation, and through it and related entities, Brown Brothers Harriman moved funds, bonds, gold, coal, oil, and steel between the United States and Germany throughout the 1930s and well into the war. Thyssen's Steel Trust, United Steelworks, produced fully half of Germany's steel and more than a third of its explosives during the war years. This wasn't a marginal sideline. It was the backbone of German military production, partially bankrolled through a New York banking operation, whose managing director would later represent Connecticut in the U.S. Senate. On October 20th, 1942, nearly a year after Pearl Harbor brought America formally into the war, the U.S. government seized Union Banking Corporation's assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act, along with 5 related Bush-Harriman entities around the same time. Declassified documents, later reviewed by journalists and researchers, confirmed that Prescott Bush continued working with the Thyssen financial network, even after America went to war with Germany. No prosecution ever followed, and no lasting public scandal touched him during his lifetime. He was elected to the Senate in 1952 and served 2 terms. His family went on to occupy the White House for a combined 12 years across 2 generations.
Of all the financial dynasties that played both sides of World War II, perhaps the most architecturally elegant belonged to Sweden's Wallenberg family, a dynasty so deeply woven into Swedish society that by the 1970s, its businesses employed 40% of the country's industrial workforce and accounted for 40% of the total value of the Stockholm Stock Exchange. Sweden was officially neutral throughout the war, but for the Wallenbergs, neutrality wasn't the same as staying out of it. It was an opportunity. The family's flagship institution, Stockholm's Enskilda Bank, was run during the war by brothers Jacob and Marcus Wallenberg, who positioned themselves on opposite sides of the conflict at once. Jacob managed trade negotiations and commercial ties with Nazi Germany, while Marcus cultivated relationships with the Allies, particularly Britain and the United States. Together, the family maintained financial connections in both directions, drawing profit from each side while committing fully to neither.
One well-documented episode involved the Bosch Group, the German engineering conglomerate producing critical components for the Nazi war machine. When Allied scrutiny threatened to expose Bosch's Nazi ties and jeopardize its international subsidiaries, Enskilda Bank stepped in and acquired those subsidiaries on paper, creating the appearance that they were neutral Swedish-owned assets rather than German ones. American Bosch Corporation was one such subsidiary. Suspicious from the outset, the U.S. government seized the American operation in 1942 as enemy property. By war's end, American investigators, working through captured German corporate records, had traced the ownership web back to the Wallenberg Bank. In August 1945, the U.S. Treasury Department formally blacklisted Jacob and Marcus Wallenberg as blocked nationals, and the bank faced a financial blockade, barring it from doing business in the United States until 1947. The Wallenbergs were called to Washington for committee hearings that stretched through the autumn of 1945, with investigators concluding the bank had not only concealed the true ownership of these assets, but had lied about it under questioning. No criminal charges were filed. Thomas McKittrick, the American who ran the BIS through those same years,
later described Marcus Wallenberg as his most important mentor during his early years as BIS president, the man who taught him how to navigate between opposing European powers, lessons McKittrick then applied at the most powerful secret bank in the world. Once the blockade lifted, the Wallenbergs resumed business as usual, invested, expanded, and became key architects of post-war Swedish industrial power. Today, their investment vehicle, Investor AB, holds stakes in companies including Ericsson, AstraZeneca, Atlas Copco, ABB, and Saab, with a market capitalization around $60 billion.
The bankers who ran the BIS during the war likely believed, sincerely, that they were serving something larger than either side of the conflict, that keeping the machinery of international settlement alive was, in the long run, a gift to humanity. They may even have been right about the long-term value of those institutions. But the price of keeping them running was paid by the people whose gold was melted down, whose accounts were seized, and whose deaths were in no small part made possible by capital flowing through those pristine marble lobbies. That's the piece of the story the official histories rarely capture, the part where profit and atrocity share the same ledger, where some of the most respected men of their generation looked at the worst catastrophe in human history and asked not how to stop it, but how to make sure the books balanced once it was over.
This is the story official histories rarely tell, and it's only one thread in a much bigger, hidden pattern of how power and money have always moved together behind closed doors. If this opened your eyes even a little, don't scroll past it in silence. Drop a comment and tell me which part shocked you the most: the submarine, the gold, or the family names you didn't expect to see. Hit like if you believe history like this deserves to be seen. Share it with someone who still thinks textbooks tell the whole story. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the next story goes even deeper into the hidden architecture of power, and you will not want to miss it. See you in the next one.